A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. Solitude Before the Storm. The threads of her life were woven in monotony, each strand identical to the one before, creating a tapestry of predictable days that blurred into seasons. Isabella had stopped counting the years around the third one of working in Lord Edwin's household in Brackham, a village that sat suspended between the sprawling forests and the distant roads leading to places she would never visit. 24 winters had passed since her birth, and somewhere along the passage of time, she had accepted that her existence would remain confined to the narrow space of her small cottage and the larger space of Edwin's workhouse, where looms dominated the interior like silent sentries. Brackham was a modest settlement. 200 souls inhabited its boundaries, their lives intersecting only when necessary at the market square or at the Lord's annual gathering. Most had families that provided the structure of their days, the laughter that filled evenings, the warmth of shared meals. Isabella had none of these things. Her grandmother had raised her with quiet efficiency, teaching her the language of threads and patterns, the meditative rhythm of weaving. When her grandmother died 5 winters ago, marked only by a fever that came without warning and left without mercy, Isabella inherited the cottage and the solitude that came with it. Lord Edwin was not a cruel man. He paid her wages in coins and bread, offered her shelter within his household during the coldest months if she desired it, though she preferred the isolation of her own space. He seemed to regard her as one might regard a particularly reliable tool, valuable for her function, unremarkable in every other capacity. Other women in the village whispered about her choices, about the peculiarity of a woman her age living alone, choosing the company of looms over marriage and children. Their whispers did not touch her. She had learned long ago that the opinions of others held no weight against the simplicity of existing on her own terms. The work was demanding in its repetition. Day after day, she sat at the loom, her fingers moving through sequences her hands could execute without instruction from her mind. The cloth she produced was of exceptional quality, fine enough for merchants to pay premium prices when they passed through the village quarterly, strong enough to withstand years of use. This skill was the only thing that made her visible in Brackham, the only reason Lord Edwin continued to retain her services despite her unsuitability as a conventional woman. Winter arrived early that year. The merchants who traveled the northern routes warned of unprecedented cold moving down from the mountain passages, spoke of unusual patterns in the snow and wind. Most paid them no attention. Winters came and went with predictable harshness, but this one carried an edge that seemed to sharpen as the weeks progressed. By early December, the village was gripped by a cold that transformed the landscape into something hostile and unyielding. Snow fell in quantities that made travel between cottages treacherous. Edwin's workhouse closed for a full month, an occurrence so rare that Isabella found herself with unstructured time stretching before her like an unknown continent. She remained in her cottage, maintaining the fire that was her primary defense against the encroaching freeze, conserving her supplies of grain and preserved vegetables, existing in the quiet that had become her natural state. The morning the snow fell heaviest was also the morning her wood supply reached its critical threshold. There remained perhaps 4 days' worth of fuel if she rationed carefully, but rationing meant allowing the interior temperature to drop dangerously low. The sensible choice would have been to remain within her cottage and hope for a break in the weather, but sensibility and Isabella had always maintained a complicated relationship. She wrapped herself in layers of wool she had woven, tied her hair back with cord, and pushed into the landscape that had become unrecognizable under the weight of accumulating snow. The ravine where fallen trees gathered lay perhaps half an hour's walk from her cottage in normal conditions. This morning, moving through drifts that reached her thighs, the journey took twice as long. The forest was eerily silent. Birds had disappeared. Even the wind had become still, as though the world itself had chosen to hold its breath. Isabella collected deadwood mechanically, stacking pieces against her body, building a bundle she could carry back. Her fingers were numb despite the gloves, her face stinging from the cold's assault. She was preparing to turn back when she heard it, a sound that pierced the silence with unexpected urgency. It was a whimper. Not quite animal, yet undeniably not human. Isabella froze, listening. The sound came again, urgent and desperate, emanating from somewhere deeper within the forest, beyond the immediate clearing. She knew the intelligent response would be to ignore it, to return to her cottage with the wood she had gathered, to maintain the careful boundaries she had constructed between herself and the rest of the world. Instead, she found herself moving toward the source of the sound, pushing through brush weighted down with ice and snow. What she discovered in a small clearing bordered by dense evergreen growth stopped her breathing momentarily. A wolf lay collapsed across the snow, its fur brilliant white-silver despite the coating of frost covering its body. For a moment, Isabella thought it was merely a wolf, one of the creatures that occasionally ventured from deeper wilderness into the peripheral territories. But as she stepped closer, she recognized details that contradicted this assumption. The animal's fur was too pristine despite its current condition, too well maintained. Its paws appeared small, the proportions suggesting youth rather than maturity. Most damning were the remnants of rope still wound around its neck, partially buried in fur, the evidence of captivity unmistakable. The creature was breathing, though barely, its sides heaving with labored effort. Injuries marked its left flank, deep gashes that had bled enough to stain the surrounding snow pink. The wounds suggested flight, desperation, and survival against odds that should have proven insurmountable. Isabella found herself moving without conscious decision, removing the wool wrapping from around her body, the same strips she had intended as a barrier against the cold, and wrapping them around the small creature with utmost care. She gathered the wolf, for what else could she call it, into her arms. It was impossibly light, no heavier than the wool and thread she carried daily to the market. Its body was cold, colder than something living should be, and its pulse beneath her palm was faint enough that she had to press carefully to confirm it still existed. The moment stretched across a threshold she did not fully comprehend, a boundary between her isolated, orderly world and something vast and incomprehensible. The journey back to her cottage felt longer than any journey she had previously taken, though she moved faster now, driven by urgency rather than routine collection. The snow continued its relentless fall, the wind beginning to gather strength as if the forest itself was protesting her intrusion into its depths. She did not question why she carried this creature homeward, instead of leaving it to whatever fate awaited it in the wilderness. Compassion, when it arose in her rarely, was not an emotion she interrogated. Her cottage was small but warm when she entered it, the fire she had carefully maintained burning steadily despite her absence. Isabella placed the creature beside the hearth, as close to the warmth as was safe. She worked methodically, her hands remembering the techniques her grandmother had taught her for treating wounded animals, techniques she had believed she would never require. She heated water from the well bucket on her shelf, cleaned the wounds with cloth and gentle pressure, applied the few herbal preparations that constituted her medical resources. The wolf, the creature, did not wake. Its breathing remained shallow but present. Isabella remained awake through the night, monitoring its condition, adding wood to the fire at intervals, and occasionally forcing small amounts of warm milk into the animal's mouth. She sat in the darkness of her cottage with this impossible creature beside her, and felt something shift in the carefully arranged architecture of her isolation. By dawn, she had stopped attempting to understand what was happening, and simply accepted the reality that her solitude had been interrupted. Chapter 2. The Creature Between Worlds. The third dawn arrived with pale light filtering through the single window of her cottage, and that was when the creature opened its eyes. Isabella had not abandoned her vigil throughout the intervening nights. She had shifted positions occasionally to prevent her muscles from seizing completely, but sleep had eluded her. Her entire consciousness had narrowed to the rise and fall of the animal's breathing, the subtle shifts in its body temperature, the assessment of whether each breath might be its last. She had never been responsible for maintaining another's existence before, and the weight of it pressed against her chest with an intensity that bordered on suffocation. The moment those brilliant blue eyes opened, she understood something fundamental had altered in the architecture of her understanding. No ordinary wolf possessed eyes of that particular blue, a shade that contained depths suggesting intelligence far beyond animal cognition. The pup's gaze tracked across the interior of her cottage with deliberate awareness, and when those eyes found her face, there was recognition in them, not fear, not the defensive wariness of a wounded creature encountering potential threat. Recognition coupled with something that resembled gratitude, though she was hesitant to attribute human emotions to an animal. Isabella moved with careful deliberation. Understanding through instinct she could not name that sudden movements might trigger panic. She prepared warm milk from what little supply she possessed, heated it gently over the fire until steam began to rise from the cup. The creature watched her movements without breaking eye contact, its breathing gradually stabilizing as it observed her routine. She knelt beside it, offering the cup at an angle that would allow it to drink without raising its head. The pup's tongue emerged tentatively, lapping at the warm liquid with visible desperation. It consumed everything she offered, then looked directly at her as if requesting additional portions. Over the following days, an unexpected communication developed between woman and creature. Isabella began to comprehend that this was no ordinary animal. When she pointed toward the water basin, the pup approached it and drank. When she indicated the herb poultices she had prepared for its wounds, it permitted her to apply them without resistance or aggression. More puzzling still, when she spoke to it in low, measured tones, it responded to her voice as if understanding the substance of what she conveyed. There was a quality to its awareness that transcended the boundaries between human and animal entirely. She attempted different vocalizations, attempting to discern if the creature responded to particular sounds or inflections. When she accidentally uttered something approximating a shortened version of its essence, a name she had not deliberately chosen, but that emerged from somewhere in her throat, the pup's ear twitched in recognition. That reaction repeated consistently whenever she produced that particular sound. She began calling it by that name, a practice that seemed to deepen whatever connection existed between them. The wound on its flank presented ongoing concern, while the external injuries were responding well to her ministrations. Isabella could sense there was something deeper happening within the creature's body that existed beyond her capacity to treat. The infection that threatened in the early stages seemed to be receding, but there remained a vulnerability in the way the pup moved, a careful guardedness that suggested internal distress. She increased her preparation of medicinal herbs, crushing them into pastes that she would encourage the creature to consume. Whether from genuine healing properties or simply from her devotion to its care, the animal gradually showed improvement. It was on the 6th day of the creature's residence in her cottage that the transformation occurred. Isabella had been attending to the most severe of the wounds, applying fresh poultices with meticulous care, when the pup's entire body began to convulse with a violence that initially suggested illness or seizure. She started backward, alarmed, but found herself paralyzed by indecision between retreat and remaining close to the creature she had committed herself to protecting. The transformation itself was almost indescribable. Bones within the creature's frame began to restructure with sounds like branches snapping beneath winter ice. Fur receded and vanished, as though being drawn inward through the animal's skin. The physical form elongated and shifted, reorganizing itself according to principles that Isabella's rational mind refused to process. Within the span of mere seconds, the creature that had occupied the position near her hearth transformed into something entirely different, a small human child, appearing to be approximately 7 winters old, with pale skin suggesting prolonged deprivation of sunlight and hair, the color of winter frost. Isabella's scream emerged before conscious thought could prevent it. She stumbled backward until her spine met the wall of her cottage, her breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps that bordered on hyperventilation. Her mind fractured across multiple simultaneous compressions of reality. The creature was not an animal. The creature had never been an animal. The creature was a child, a human child who transformed into a wolf. The rope marks around its neck that she had observed were not evidence of animal capture, but of human abduction. The intelligence she had sensed radiating from its gaze was not unusual animal cunning, but rather the natural intelligence of a thinking, feeling being trapped within bestial form. She remained frozen against her wall for hours, her consciousness cycling through terror, confusion, and a growing realization that the fundamental structure of her understanding of the world had been rendered obsolete. Everything her grandmother had taught her had been incomplete. Everything the village had acknowledged as reality was constructed upon deliberate erasure of truths that ran deeper and stranger than she had ever imagined possible. The child, alarmed by her screaming, transformed back into its lupine form with instinctive panic. It pressed itself into the far corner of the cottage, trembling visibly, its blue eyes reflecting a hurt that transcended species designation. The fear in its expression was not the fear of an animal confronted by danger. It was the fear of a conscious being who had been rejected by the one entity upon which it had begun to depend. That realization struck Isabella with more force than her initial shock. The creature had been attempting to reveal itself to her, had been testing whether she could accept what it was, and she had responded with horror. The recognition of her own cruelty forced her to move beyond her paralysis. She forced her breathing into deliberate patterns, employing the same techniques her grandmother had taught her for calming anxious animals. She spoke in the lowest register she could manage, producing sounds that were meant to convey safety rather than judgment. Gradually, over the passage of hours, the small wolf's trembling diminished. It did not return to its human form. Whether from fear of her reaction or from exhaustion following the transformation, it remained in its canine state, though it accepted her presence sufficiently to allow her continued proximity. Through the subsequent days, a fragile communication began to establish itself between them. The child learned that it could maintain its human form in her presence without triggering horror or rejection. It began to remain in that form for extended periods, though it moved with obvious pain and discomfort, as if its small human body was not entirely accustomed to sustained existence in that state. Isabella wove rough garments from scraps of cloth, attempting to provide the child with some semblance of covering. It remained silent most of the time, communicating through gestures and occasionally through sounds that suggested linguistic capacity, but chose not to exercise it. The trauma underlying the child's existence became gradually evident through its behavior patterns. It experienced frequent episodes of unconsciousness, accompanied by extreme distress, thrashing movements, sounds that were part whimper and part howl, a complete dissolution of consciousness, as if its mind was retreating from present circumstances into some internal refuge. When these episodes occurred, Isabella would position herself nearby, her hand steady and present, offering tactile reassurance that the creatures pursued it no further. Gradually, the frequency of these disturbances began to diminish, though they never ceased entirely. 2 weeks had passed in this peculiar isolation when Isabella confronted the reality of her situation with full clarity. She possessed knowledge that would result in her condemnation if revealed to the village. She harbored a creature, a child, she corrected herself, a child, that existed in violation of everything the ordinary world acknowledged as possible. Lord Edwin's workhouse would inevitably reopen as winter progressed. Her absence from routine would require explanation. The child required resources she could not indefinitely provide: sustenance of greater variety and quantity, medical attention beyond her limited capabilities, and most pressingly, understanding of its own nature that she possessed no framework to provide. The child needed someone who could explain what it was. It needed guidance in controlling its transformation, in managing the trauma that clearly saturated its consciousness, in comprehending its own identity. Isabella possessed none of these resources. She existed as a stopgap between the creature's immediate death and whatever alternative fate awaited it. It was in the midst of this realization that the sounds began. First, there came a single call, a vocalization that carried across the landscape with an authority that transcended ordinary animal communication. It was answered by a second voice, and then a third. The child's response was instantaneous and instinctive. Its form began to shift, its eyes transforming to that strange amber shade, its body tensing with an emotion Isabella recognized as desperate longing mixed with profound fear. It moved to her window, pressing its small frame against the glass, releasing sounds that were part howl and part desperate call. Something was searching for the child, and based on the escalating volume of response, whatever searched was drawing inexorably closer. Chapter 3. The arrival of 50. The silence of the forest shattered like thin glass beneath a boot heel. The sound that emerged from the darkness beyond her cottage was not something Isabella could categorize within her existing framework of animal vocalizations. It carried a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the stone walls surrounding her, a call that was simultaneously command and declaration. The timbre of it suggested something far larger and more ancient than any creature she had encountered in her isolated existence. The child's response was instantaneous and visceral. Every muscle in its small frame tensed simultaneously, its eyes transforming from that pale blue to an amber shade that seemed to hold depths of instinctual recognition. The sounds it produced in return were part wolf howl and part desperate vocalization, a response that transcended the boundary between animal and human communication. There was longing in those sounds, and beneath the longing lay something more fundamental. A call to pack, to family, to the entity that held dominion over whatever existence the child inhabited when not sheltered within her cottage. Isabella watched as the child moved toward her single window, pressing its small form against the glass with an urgency that bordered on frantic. More calls erupted across the landscape, a symphony of howls that seemed to converge upon her cottage from multiple directions simultaneously. The sound patterns suggested coordination, deliberate strategy. These were not wild animals responding to territorial claims, but rather organized forces moving with unified purpose across the frozen landscape. When dawn broke, Isabella understood the full scope of what had transpired during the night. The forest surrounding her cottage had been transformed into something that resembled an occupied territory. Approximately 50 to 60 wolves of varying sizes and coat colorations blanketed the landscape in patterns that suggested tactical positioning rather than random settlement. Their movements were synchronized and economical, nothing like the chaotic behavior of feral predators. These creatures communicated through vocalizations that ranged from low rumbles to high-pitched exchanges, a complete linguistic system operating beyond Isabella's comprehension. Some of these wolves possessed proportions that violated her understanding of natural animal development. Individual specimens towered over their smaller counterparts, in ways that suggested either exceptional genetics or something far more mysterious than ordinary animal variation. Scars marked many of them, visible evidence of previous conflicts, wounds that had healed into patterns suggesting experience and survival through significant adversity. These were not creatures of the wilderness encountering humans for the first time. These were entities that had participated in the complex structures of dominance and hierarchy across multiple confrontations. The first wolf approached her cottage door with a deliberation that suggested intelligence directing every movement. Isabella pressed herself away from the threshold, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized the reality of her situation. The child, sensing the presence outside, transformed without hesitation into its lupine form. The metamorphosis occurred with practiced efficiency, the small human body restructuring itself into that of a young wolf, its coat silver-white matching the pup that Isabella had found in the forest weeks prior. The child positioned itself between Isabella and the approaching predator, releasing vocalizations that were part greeting and part declaration of territorial claim. The largest of the wolves began its transformation, as Isabella watched in frozen incomprehension. The process was unlike anything she could have imagined. Bones restructuring with sounds like wood splintering, the massive form compressing and reforming, fur receding to reveal skin and musculature beneath. Within seconds, where a creature of profound predatory power had existed, there now stood a man. He was tall enough that his head nearly touched the ceiling of her modest cottage, his frame constructed from musculature that spoke of violence and combat experience. A beard descended to his chest, carefully maintained despite its length. His eyes possessed a blue-gray coloration that seemed to contain within it centuries of accumulated authority. Scars marked his visible skin in patterns that suggested deliberate cultivation, rather than accidental damage. His torso displayed tattoos rendered in symbols Isabella did not recognize, markings that seemed to shift slightly in the changing light, as though they possessed properties beyond conventional pigmentation. When he moved, the air itself seemed to reorganize around his presence, the space within her small cottage suddenly feeling impossibly confined. At his side, 2 additional figures materialized in human form, both displaying the physical markers of combat experience. The woman among them possessed dark hair, cropped short to her skull, and eyes that held the watchful assessment of someone trained in evaluating threats. The men flanking her carried weapons with casual familiarity, their postures reflecting the discipline of individuals accustomed to violence. The man's gaze swept across the interior of her cottage with methodical precision before settling upon Isabella with an intensity that seemed to pierce through her deliberately constructed emotional barriers. In that moment of assessment, she recognized something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of her circumstances. His expression was not hostile, but it contained within it an authority that transcended human hierarchy and social convention. When he directed vocalizations toward the child wolf, the sounds were not words, as she understood them, but they carried the unmistakable weight of command. The child wolf moved with instantaneous obedience toward the tall man. But before the gap between them could close completely, the pup pivoted sharply and pressed itself against Isabella's legs. The gesture was unambiguous, a statement of loyalty and protection directed toward her, rather than toward the figure who clearly held dominant position in whatever social structure governed these creatures. The tall man's expression shifted subtly. His eyes narrowed in observation, and for a moment, Isabella detected something approaching surprise crossing his features. Whatever response he had anticipated from the child did not align with what was occurring before him. His inner wolf, that inner creature that shifter culture seemed to recognize as a separate entity, did not respond with the aggression that might logically follow from discovering one's offspring bonded to a human woman of unknown status. Instead, his posture altered into something approximating acceptance, though the emotional undertones remained opaque to her human perception. He extended a hand toward the child with movements that suggested deliberately reduced threat presentation. The pup wolf shifted toward him incrementally, caught between conflicting loyalties. Isabella recognized the moment of decision crystallizing in the child's consciousness, a choice between the familiar safety of her cottage and the pull of biological connection toward this figure who carried within his bearing the authority of dominance she could sense but not fully comprehend. The child approached the tall man, who knelt to reduce the height differential. They remained in that position for extended moments, the man's hand resting upon the child's head with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his intimidating appearance. When he finally rose, his attention turned fully toward Isabella. The assessment in his gaze was thorough and deliberate, moving across her frame with the precision of someone evaluating resources or potential threat. Whatever he concluded from that examination resulted in a subtle modification of his posture, a barely perceptible shift suggesting reassessment of initial calculations. The woman at his side produced vocalizations that Isabella recognized as language, despite her inability to comprehend the specific meanings. The man responded with confirmation, then gestured toward Isabella with movements that suggested directive rather than request. The intention became clear when the woman began moving toward her, with purposeful intent. Isabella found herself being escorted from her cottage, her protests emerging as ineffectual sounds in the face of circumstances that had spiraled completely beyond her capacity to influence or control. The child remained at the tall man's side, occasionally glancing backward toward Isabella, but offering no resistance to the separation occurring between them. The woman maintained contact with Isabella's arm as they moved through the forest, the journey extending across distances that felt increasingly vast and alien. Through gaps in the tree coverage, Isabella observed the assembled wolves moving in coordinated patterns around them, a protective perimeter that suggested calculated security protocols rather than random movement. The structure that emerged from the forest after what felt like hours of travel was nothing she could have conceived from her position of isolated ignorance. A fortress of stone and defensive architecture rose before her, medieval in its construction, but bearing qualities of permanence and power that suggested generations of strategic development. Towers extended upward toward the sky, their positions calculated for optimal surveillance of surrounding territories. Walls fortified with construction techniques that indicated both experience and resources, far exceeding anything Lord Edwin could command. Within those walls existed not merely accommodation, but an entire civilization operating according to principles and hierarchies that existed completely beyond the parameters of the village society she had inhabited. The tall man walked ahead of her toward the interior structures, the child still positioned at his side, and Isabella recognized with crystalline clarity that everything about her previous existence had been rendered obsolete in a single night of transformation and discovery. Chapter 4. The Negotiation and the Choice. The fortress interior was nothing like Isabella had imagined during her sheltered years in Brackham. Stone corridors extended in directions that seemed to defy logical architectural progression, their surfaces marked with age and deliberate ornamentation. Tapestries depicting scenes she could not fully interpret hung along the walls, their colors faded, but their subject matter suggesting histories spanning generations. The air carried scents unfamiliar to her experience: leather from equipment and furnishings, herbs she could not identify, and underneath it all, the distinct musk that seemed to emanate from the shifters who moved through these halls with practiced authority. The tall man, whose name she had not yet been provided, moved through the fortress corridors with the certainty of absolute dominion. His presence seemed to ripple outward from his physical form, causing others to alter their trajectories and lower their gazes as he passed. The tall man's gaze softened by a fraction. He rested his palm on the pup's crown, and when he spoke, the sound was almost human. "Brennan," he said, shaping the name like something both fragile and ancient. The pup's ears tipped forward. At the sound of it, Isabella understood two things at once: that this child had always belonged to someone, and that names could be leashes or lanterns depending on who spoke them. Brennan remained at his side, occasionally glancing backward toward Isabella but offering no resistance to the separation that had been established between them. She was escorted by the woman with dark cropped hair through passages that eventually led to a chamber where she was instructed to remain pending further direction. The chamber was more than adequate. The furnishings suggested someone of considerable status had previously occupied this space. A bed with actual linen coverings occupied one corner. A wooden frame held a mirror with genuine glass rather than polished metal. There was even a basin of water awaiting her arrival, still steaming slightly as though someone had anticipated her needs with precision. Isabella sat upon the edge of the bed and attempted to process the magnitude of what had transpired, but her mind refused to organize the information into coherent narrative structures. Hours passed. She might have slept, though she possessed no clear memory of the transition between wakefulness and unconsciousness. It was the appearance of the dark-haired woman, who introduced herself as Marin with minimal elaboration, that pulled her awareness back toward the present moment. Marin was Beta, she explained through a translator who had appeared seemingly from nowhere. A woman named Eleanor, who spoke both the linguistic patterns of the shifter hierarchy and the common language of village settlements. Beta meant second position within the pack structure, which apparently bore significant implications Isabella did not yet comprehend. Marin's gaze was evaluative in ways that suggested she had performed similar assessments numerous times previously. She spoke in a language that was not entirely foreign to Eleanor's translation, though Eleanor's interpretation seemed to carry nuances the original words did not fully contain. Brennan had been traumatized by his captivity, Eleanor translated. The child had developed significant psychological attachments to the one individual who had offered him protection, without expectation of compensation. Isabella's presence was deemed therapeutic to his recovery. Therefore, Isabella would serve as tutor to the child. Not merely caretaker, but educator in the customs of human behavior, in language refinement, in the emotional stability that appeared to be directly correlated with the child's psychological well-being. It was not a request. It was directive delivered through channels that suggested any alternative course of action was not genuinely available to Isabella, despite the absence of overt coercion. Over the subsequent weeks, Isabella began to comprehend the structure of the world into which she had been thrust. Women appeared regularly to instruct her in court etiquette, in the protocols governing interaction with individuals of different status hierarchies. They taught her how to position her body in greeting, how to address shifters of various ranks, what constituted appropriate topics for conversation, and what should be scrupulously avoided. The instruction was thorough and methodical, though it operated from assumption that Isabella possessed baseline knowledge she clearly did not possess. The lessons frequently generated tension when Isabella chose to question, rather than simply absorb the information being presented. When an instructor explained that women should always defer to the opinions of alpha-ranked males, Isabella asked why this was necessary, rather than simply accepting the pronouncement. When taught that certain topics were considered inappropriate for female discussion, she questioned the reasoning underlying such restrictions. Her instructors appeared perpetually shocked by her inquiries, as though her role was to receive information rather than engage critically with its underlying logic. After approximately 3 weeks of intensive instruction, Isabella found herself increasingly restless within the confines of the chamber that had been assigned to her accommodation. She understood, through accumulated observation, that the fortress contained spaces beyond her designated quarters. There were gardens, She had observed through windows, areas that suggested expansive territories she had not yet encountered. On a morning when her instructors had not arrived for their scheduled session, she made the deliberate choice to explore. She encountered resistance at one of the fortress gates. 2 guards whose status she had not yet learned to accurately assess positioned themselves between her and the exterior spaces beyond the barrier. They did not speak to her, but their body language conveyed unmistakable directive that she was not permitted to proceed. Isabella recognized the gesture toward captivity that existed beneath the superficial courtesy. She was not imprisoned in the traditional sense. No visible restraints bound her movement. But her freedom was circumscribed by forces that were not formally articulated, but were nonetheless absolute. The knowledge that she was contained, regardless of the absence of visible chains, generated a fury that she had not permitted herself to fully experience since arriving at the fortress. She was considering her options when a presence emerged from the stone archway behind her. The tall man appeared with movements that suggested he had been aware of her location before she had become conscious of his approach. He assessed the situation with a glance that seemed to contain comprehensive understanding of both her attempted transgression and the guard's appropriate response. He directed his attention toward the guards with vocalizations that resulted in their immediate removal from the gateway entrance. Then he gestured toward Isabella with movements that suggested she should accompany him. They walked through the fortress corridors in silence, the absence of conversation creating tension that Isabella felt accumulating between them. He led her toward the outer perimeter of the fortress until they reached a gate significantly more substantial than the one where she had encountered resistance. The landscape beyond stretched vast and seemingly unrestricted. Mountains rose in the distance. Forests extended across territories that suggested vast territorial holdings. The morning light illuminated everything with crystalline clarity that made the reality of her situation visceral and unavoidable. He positioned himself beside her at the threshold and allowed her to observe the territory without interruption. Then he turned to face her directly, and his posture conveyed something that was not hostility, but rather grave deliberation. He explained through Eleanor, who had appeared alongside them with the translational services that seemed to occur whenever direct communication between human and shifter was required, that Isabella was not a prisoner. She was free to depart. Nothing prevented her from walking through this gate and returning to her previous existence in Brackham. Nothing constrained her departure, except the consequences that would inevitably follow from such abandonment. Brennan would experience profound psychological deterioration if his primary emotional attachment was severed. The child had developed pathological reliance upon her presence. Removal of that presence would likely result in trauma from which recovery might require years or might never fully occur. Furthermore, Lord Edwin had been informed of her presence and had negotiated her formal release from any prior obligations. There was no refuge awaiting her return to the village. She would be a woman adrift, without legitimate purpose or social positioning. However, none of this negated her fundamental right to choose her own trajectory. The decision regarding her continued presence was entirely hers. If she wished to depart, he would escort her personally to the fortress edge and ensure her safety for the journey ahead. If she wished to remain, she would do so as participant in circumstances she had consciously accepted rather than as individual constrained against her will. Isabella stood at the threshold of the gate and comprehended that she was being offered a choice that was genuinely available to her, in ways that most choices in her previous existence had never been. She could reclaim her solitude. She could return to her loom and her isolation. She could resume the existence she had inhabited before the creature appeared in the forest on that snow-covered morning. Or she could choose to remain in this fortress with this tall man whose motivations she did not comprehend, and this child to whom she had become irreplaceably bonded. She could accept circumstances that had been imposed upon her through forces beyond her control, and transform them into deliberate commitment through the exercise of her own autonomous will. The distinction seemed crucial, though she could not fully articulate why. She turned to face him directly, and conveyed through Eleanor the substance of her decision. She would remain. Not because she was coerced into compliance, but because Brennan required her continued presence, and because she had developed commitment to this child's well-being that superseded her previous attachment to solitude. She was choosing to stay, with full comprehension of what her choice entailed, placing her own preferences into subordinate position relative to the needs of another person. His expression shifted subtly, and there was something in his gaze that suggested her response had altered some calculation he had been conducting. He placed his hand upon her shoulder momentarily, the contact conveying something that might have been approval or might have been something far more complex that she lacked the framework to interpret. Then he turned, and she followed him back through the fortress gates, toward the interior spaces that were becoming increasingly familiar as the days accumulated into weeks. Chapter 5. The Reckoning and Confessions. 3 months had accumulated into patterns that seemed almost natural despite their fundamental strangeness. Isabella's daily existence had developed rhythms that integrated her presence into the fortress structure in ways she could not have anticipated during those initial disorienting weeks. She instructed Brennan in languages, in basic literacy, through the scratching of symbols upon parchment, in the stories that her grandmother had transmitted to her across generations of oral tradition. The child responded to her teaching with enthusiasm that suggested he was absorbing not merely the content of her instruction, but also deriving comfort from the sustained attention and presence she provided. It was during a morning when Eleanor arrived at her quarters with an expression that conveyed significantly more tension than usual, that the fragile equilibrium Isabella had constructed began to fracture. The translator conveyed information through measured vocalizations that suggested the communication itself was complicated by emotional undercurrents. A man had been captured, the individual responsible for Brennan's sequestration, for the ropes that had marked the child's neck, for the trauma that still manifested in the boy's nightmares. His name was Victor, and he had been apprehended attempting to sell information regarding the fortress security to entities hostile to Corvin's authority. There would be an assembly. All members of authority within the fortress hierarchy would gather in the Great Hall. Victor would be presented, judged according to protocols that governed justice within shifter society, and whatever consequences were deemed appropriate would be implemented. Isabella was not required to attend, Eleanor conveyed with deliberate emphasis. In fact, it was considered inappropriate for individuals of Isabella's status to witness formal proceedings of this magnitude. But Brennan had expressed desire to attend. The child needed to confront the entity that had caused him such profound suffering, and Brennan's psychological stability had become sufficiently linked to Isabella's presence that his anxiety levels spiked precipitously whenever she was absent from his immediate vicinity. Therefore, the unusual decision had been made. Isabella would occupy a private observation chamber with Marin as chaperone, a location that would allow her and the child to witness proceedings without direct participation in the formal structures of the assembly. The Great Hall was vast in ways that Isabella's initial observations had not fully conveyed. Stone columns extended upward toward a ceiling so distant it seemed to dissolve into shadow. The assembled shifters numbered in the hundreds. Alphas of various packs occupied tiered seating that suggested hierarchy and rank distinction. Warriors positioned themselves in formations that conveyed tactical preparedness, despite the supposedly ceremonial nature of the gathering. Tension permeated the atmosphere with a density that Isabella could perceive even from her elevated observation position. Victor was brought forward in chains. He was human, which somehow intensified the wrongness of his situation more than Isabella might have anticipated. He possessed physical markers, suggesting he had experienced violence previously. Scars crossing his skin, a frame built for the application and absorption of force. His gaze held the calculating assessment of someone who had committed himself to survival through manipulation and strategic adaptation. The tall man, Corvin, though Isabella still felt hesitation when applying that name to his presence, stood elevated above the assembled mass. His bearing conveyed absolute authority, though he appeared to employ no deliberate mechanisms to establish dominance. His mere presence commanded attention and compliance from everyone surrounding him. When he vocalized in that language Isabella could not comprehend, the entire assembly fell into silence so profound it seemed to absorb the very capacity for sound to exist. Proceedings moved through phases that Eleanor whispered translations for, though her voice contained emotional undertones, suggesting she found the proceedings distressing despite her position within the hierarchy. Victor was presented with evidence of his crimes. He was provided opportunity to defend himself, though his words seemed directed toward minimizing his culpability rather than establishing genuine innocence. He attempted negotiation, offering information and resources in exchange for mercy, but his offers were rejected with vocalizations that conveyed finality. Then Brennan was presented. The child was small in that vast space, his form appearing diminished by the architectural scale and the mass of predatory shifters surrounding them. But when Corvin gestured the child forward, Brennan approached with courage that generated something approaching admiration in Isabella's chest. The boy positioned himself at a vantage point where his gaze could meet Victor's directly, and the moment of recognition that passed between them seemed to contain years of trauma compressed into singular instants of profound clarity. What followed was execution rather than prolonged suffering, but it was execution that was absolute and final. Isabella found her gaze shifting away, her stomach convulsing with responses that were partially physiological and partially emotional. Marin placed a steadying hand upon her shoulder, but offered no other commentary. Brennan remained present for the entirety of the proceedings, his small form rigid with emotion that Isabella could not fully categorize. The aftermath was more damaging than Isabella would have anticipated. That evening, when she attempted to settle Brennan for sleep, the child descended into panic that was far more severe than any episode she had previously witnessed. His small body became rigid, then began to shake with violence that seemed as though it might tear apart his physical form. His vocalizations were wordless, expressions of anguish that contained no linguistic structure, merely raw emotional devastation manifested through sound. She held him through the night, her hands steady upon his shaking form, her voice producing the lowest frequencies she could generate to communicate safety and protection. By dawn, he had exhausted himself into unconsciousness, but she remained vigilant against the possibility of his nightmares manifesting violently during his sleep state. For the following weeks, Brennan's separation anxiety intensified dramatically. When Isabella attempted to leave his presence, even for brief intervals, he descended into psychological deterioration that was painful to witness. His transformations became unstable. His appetite diminished. The progress he had made toward emotional recovery seemed to fracture under the weight of having witnessed his abuser's death. Isabella found herself functionally confined. She could not depart from Brennan's vicinity without triggering episodes that required hours of careful emotional management to resolve. Her frustration accumulated into something approaching fury that she had not permitted herself to fully experience since her initial arrival at the fortress. She had made her choice to remain, she reminded herself. She had accepted this confinement willingly. Yet the reality of her situation, the absolute constraint upon her personal autonomy, generated rage that threatened to consume her. On a night when Brennan had finally achieved sleep after hours of distressed vocalizations, Isabella made the deliberate choice to confront Corvin directly. She navigated the fortress corridors with determination that superseded her uncertainty regarding their destination, following instinct and architectural patterns until she arrived at chambers that bore the unmistakable markers of being inhabited by an individual of considerable authority. He was present, as though he had anticipated her arrival. He was in a partial state of transformation, his upper frame retaining human characteristics, while his lower body maintained lupine qualities. The sight should have generated fear, but Isabella's fury had superseded such reasonable responses. She vocalized her accusation through Eleanor, who materialized from shadows with the consistency of a personage whose primary function involved appearing whenever communication across species boundaries became necessary. How could he imprison her in this fortress when she was free to choose her circumstances? How could he demand she sacrifice her autonomy for a child who would never heal sufficiently to validate her sacrifice? How could he maintain the pretense that she possessed choice when every path available to her led toward further constraint? Corvin's response was delivered in tones that were devoid of defensiveness or aggression. He explained through Eleanor that his inner wolf, the internal creature that was an essential aspect of shifter identity, had recognized Isabella as potential mate from the moment of their first encounter. His inner wolf perceived something within her that transcended ordinary human designation. She was bonded to his son through commitments that ran deeper than rational explanation, and therefore his inner wolf would not permit her departure. It was not choice operating through deliberate constraint. It was recognition operating at levels beneath conscious comprehension. Isabella attempted to generate counter-arguments, but the substance of his explanation seemed to dissolve her anger into something more complex and difficult to name. He positioned himself closer, his hand extending with movements that suggested deliberate reduction of threat presentation. He touched her face with surprising gentleness, and in that contact, she perceived something that might have been recognition of their shared predicament. Two beings constrained by forces that operated through channels neither could completely control. Chapter 6. The Weight of Preparation. The weeks that followed Isabella's confrontation with Corvin developed into periods marked by gradual transmutation rather than dramatic alteration. Her rage did not dissipate entirely, but rather transformed into something more sustainable, a persistent undercurrent of resentment tinged with reluctant recognition that her circumstances operated according to principles she had not yet fully comprehended. Marin appeared in her quarters approximately 1 week after the nighttime encounter, offering expansion of Isabella's responsibilities within the fortress hierarchy. She would no longer serve solely as Brennan's tutor. Instead, she was invited to work with other children who inhabited the fortress grounds, pups of various ages who carried visible manifestations of psychological trauma. Some had experienced loss of parental figures through conflict. Others bore the marks of neglect or indifference from their own pack structures. Still others possessed physical or developmental differences that society had deemed problematic or deficient. They existed as peripheral figures within the fortress community, acknowledged but not integrated, present but not valued. Isabella began to work with them systematically, employing the same methodologies that had proven effective with Brennan. She recounted stories from her grandmother's collection, taught basic weaving techniques using scraps of thread and simple frames, and offered something more fundamental: consistent presence and emotional validation. The children responded to her attention with a hunger that transcended ordinary pedagogical engagement. They sought her presence as though she represented some essential element previously denied to them. Within weeks, Isabella had established informal gatherings in a section of the fortress gardens that had fallen into disuse. Children accumulated around her during designated periods, their faces reflecting concentration as they absorbed narratives and instruction. She taught them that their perceived deficiencies did not diminish their inherent value, a message that seemed to resonate with particular intensity among those who had internalized narratives of inadequacy. Corvin observed these developments in silence. Eleanor conveyed information through careful phrasing that suggested the Alpha King was receiving regular reports from individuals monitoring the fortress environment. There was less violence among the pack members. Stress levels had diminished measurably. Tensions that typically characterized pack hierarchies had moderated into something approaching equilibrium. The presence of Isabella's teaching circle seemed to generate broader effects that extended beyond the immediate participants to influence the overall atmosphere permeating the fortress structures. Marin, when they encountered each other in the fortress corridors, offered acknowledgement that was not precisely friendly, but contained elements of respect previously absent from their interactions. She confirmed that the children Isabella instructed were progressing emotionally in ways their individual healers had struggled to facilitate. Several had begun to express artistic inclinations through the weaving instruction, transforming raw materials into patterns that reflected internal emotional landscapes. The work was therapeutic in mechanisms that transcended conventional therapeutic frameworks. Yet not all responses to Isabella's integration proved positive. Lord Halwyn, the senior counselor whose position suggested decades of accumulated authority, expressed reservations during a fortress gathering that Isabella observed from peripheral positioning. His concerns were articulated with careful political phrasing that avoided direct accusation, while establishing unmistakable implication. A human woman wielding influence over shifter children represented potential complication. Humans possessed limited lifespans. Children who developed attachment to maternal figures of limited duration would inevitably experience loss and trauma when those figures inevitably departed through death or circumstance. Was it wise to establish structures that guaranteed future psychological damage? Corvin's response was delivered with tone that suggested finality rather than invitation for further discussion. He indicated that strength derived from diversity rather than homogeneous repetition. New perspectives and capabilities refreshed stagnating traditions. Any counselor who questioned this principle was welcome to step aside from their advisory position. Halwyn accepted the reprimand with visible reluctance, retreating into silence but not conceding genuine agreement. The political landscape shifted dramatically when diplomatic initiatives collapsed. Garrett, the alpha rival who had orchestrated Brennan's sequestration, rejected overtures toward negotiation and reconciliation. He offered compensation for the lost mercenaries, but denied direct involvement in the kidnapping, constructing narrative that Victor had acted independently of his authority or direction. Corvin rejected this account, but without clear evidence linking Garrett directly to the conspiracy, the formal protocols governing Alpha conflict precluded immediate military response. Then Garrett committed an act so transparently provocative that it eliminated any pretense toward diplomatic resolution. A raiding force under his command attacked a peripheral village that existed within territories under Corvin's implicit protection. 8 human inhabitants were killed, along with 2 younger shifters who were visiting the settlement. The assault was neither sophisticated nor militarily necessary. It was pure declaration of hostility, a deliberate violation of the territorial understanding that governed relations between established pacts. Corvin responded with announcement of intention to deploy military force, not through dramatic proclamation, but through communicated fact. Warriors would assemble, deployment would occur. Garrett's forces would be confronted with intention of neutralizing the threat they represented. The announcement generated immediate mobilization throughout the fortress. Approximately 55 trained warriors began preparation of equipment and tactical positioning. Marin was designated to command field operations, her position as beta entitling her to authority over strategic implementation. Thomas, the elder healer, initiated preparation of medical supplies and emergency treatment protocols. Isabella observed these preparations with recognition that her situation was about to be fundamentally altered. The tall man's attention, which had been distributed across administrative and political concerns, would soon be directed entirely toward military engagement. Brennan would require additional emotional support during this separation. She found herself preparing internally for extended periods of functioning without the presence that had gradually become central to her existence, though she had not permitted herself to acknowledge this dependency with complete honesty. 7 days after the announcement, in the interval before deployment commenced, Corvin sought her out. He appeared in the gardens where she had positioned herself among the teaching materials, ostensibly inventorying supplies, but actually engaging in internal contemplation regarding the forthcoming separation. His approach was deliberate and unhurried, suggesting this was not encounter occurring through accident, but through deliberate intention. He positioned himself beside her at the garden's edge, his presence generating the familiar displacement of atmosphere that seemed to accompany his manifestation. His hand moved with calculated gentleness to rest against her face, fingers tracing patterns that suggested communication, operating through tactile rather than linguistic channels. He did not speak through Eleanor. He did not require translation. The gesture itself conveyed substance, recognition operating at levels beneath conscious articulation, acknowledgement of connection that transcended the formal hierarchies and social structures governing their circumstances. His internal creature generated vocalizations that were not threatening but rather confirmatory, sounds that suggested recognition and protection rather than dominance or claim. In that moment, Isabella understood that he was communicating his intention through mechanisms that shifter hierarchy employed when formal language became inadequate. When he departed the gardens, it was with posture that conveyed certainty regarding his return, an expectation that matters between them would require deliberate confrontation and resolution upon his reappearance. She stood in the gardens long after his departure, processing the reality that her existence at the fortress had become irretraceably altered. She was no longer temporary resident or reluctant captive. She had become participant in structures that integrated her presence into the fortress community in ways that would render her removal profoundly destabilizing. The recognition generated neither relief nor satisfaction, but rather complex emotional response that she did not yet possess adequate framework to comprehend. Brennan required her attention as evening descended. She composed herself and returned to the child's quarters, ready to provide reassurance regarding the impending separation that would occur when his father departed for warfare. The weight of her responsibilities had transformed from burden she resented into commitment she had gradually internalized. The distinction between external imposition and internal choice having become significantly less definitive than she might have previously believed possible. Chapter 7. The Claiming and Transformation. 4 days transpired in waiting that felt compressed and stretched simultaneously. time operating according to principles that defied conventional measurement. Isabella maintained her teaching circle despite the underlying anxiety that accompanied Corvin's absence. Brennan demonstrated remarkable resilience throughout the separation, his anxiety manageable though present. The child occupied himself with activities that suggested his emotional stability had achieved measurable improvement. He engaged with other pups, participated in weaving instruction with genuine concentration, and only occasionally required reassurance regarding his father's inevitable return. The morning of the 4th day arrived with atmospheric conditions that seemed to reflect internal turbulence rather than external weather patterns. Isabella sensed the shift before receiving formal notification. Marin appeared at the gardens where the teaching circle had assembled, her expression conveying information before her vocalizations translated into understandable communication. The Alpha King had returned. Warriors had achieved victory against Garrett's forces. Several casualties existed among Corvin's contingent, but the conflict had concluded with definitiveness that suggested the rival threat had been substantially neutralized. Brennan's transformation was instantaneous. The child's entire demeanor shifted into recognition that his father had survived and was returning to the fortress. He abandoned the weaving materials mid-lesson and moved toward the fortress entrance with urgency that suggested nothing could contain his anticipation. Isabella found herself following, drawn by the child's momentum and by recognition that her own responses to news of Corvin's return operated at levels beneath conscious deliberation. The assembled warriors moved through the fortress gates in formation that conveyed both discipline and exhaustion. Their injuries were visible, bandaging across multiple fighters, limps that suggested impacts to lower extremities, the general bearing of individuals who had engaged in sustained combat and survived through combination of skill and fortune. Corvin advanced through the warriors with movements that suggested minimal physical compromise, despite the obvious presence of injuries. A deep laceration crossed his left shoulder, the wound having begun to scar already with the accelerated healing that characterized shifter physiology. When his gaze found Brennan, his expression underwent transformation that was profoundly complete. Every element of military authority retreated into secondary positioning. What emerged was something far more fundamental: recognition of filial connection, relief that transcended rational articulation, paternal devotion expressed through eyes that seemed to contain centuries of accumulated emotion, compressed into singular moments of clarity. Brennan ran to him with abandon that transcended any remaining reservation. Corvin knelt to reduce height differential, his large frame receiving the child's impact with stability that suggested this contact was precisely what his body had required. They remained in that position for extended moments, the reunion operating at levels that required no linguistic component to convey its significance. Then Corvin's attention shifted toward Isabella. She had positioned herself at controlled distance, uncertain whether her presence was appropriate during this paternal reconnection. But when his gaze settled upon her, she recognized that her uncertainty regarding her position had been rendered obsolete through the simple fact of his observation. He rose with Brennan still positioned against his body and moved toward her with deliberation that suggested calculated intention. He extended his hand without vocalizing directive, but the gesture conveyed unmistakable meaning. She accepted his hand despite recognition that doing so represented crossing threshold from which return might prove impossible. His fingers enclosed hers with gentleness that contrasted sharply with their obvious capacity for violence. He led her through fortress corridors toward his private chambers while Brennan remained with Marin, the child understanding through mechanisms she did not fully comprehend that this separation was temporary and necessary. The chamber was vast and austere, decorated with minimal ornamentation despite its obvious positioning as headquarters of absolute authority. A single window permitted observation of fortress territories extending toward distant mountains. Corvin positioned himself facing her directly, his expression reflecting emotions that transcended simple physical attraction. He placed his hand against her face with movements that were reverential rather than demanding, his touch conveying communication that operated beneath linguistic frameworks. He vocalized through Eleanor, who materialized from shadows as though she had anticipated this moment with certainty. He inquired whether she loved him, not whether she could develop affection, not whether she had learned to tolerate his presence, but whether she possessed genuine emotional commitment that transcended circumstance and obligation. The question was deceptively simple, but Isabella recognized that her response carried implications that would alter the trajectory of her entire existence. She responded through Eleanor's translation that her emotion was genuine. She loved his strength and his devotion to his son. She loved his willingness to listen when others merely dictated. She loved even those aspects of him that were undeniably dangerous. His capacity for violence when circumstances required it. His isolation that she had gradually understood as protective mechanism forged through years of bearing weight, beyond ordinary human comprehension. Corvin's response was to draw her toward him with movements that were unhurried and deliberate. He remained predominantly in human form, though his jaw extended slightly and his teeth lengthened in manner that suggested partial transformation. He positioned her with precision, exposing the vulnerable junction where her collarbone met her neck. When his bite came, it was not brutal, but rather transformative, transfer of energy that manifested as searing sensation, followed by profound connection that seemed to link her consciousness directly to his own. Isabella felt the alteration occurring instantaneously throughout her physical form. Her senses expanded beyond human parameters. The ability to perceive shifter emotions through modification of scent perception manifested with sudden clarity. She could detect Corvin's profound emotion, his fear during the war that she might disappear during his absence, his relief that she remained, his commitment to her integration into his existence as equal rather than subordinate. But more than sensory modification occurred. Something fundamental transformed within her biological structure. The alteration was not painful, but rather felt like pieces of her existence suddenly aligning into patterns that had previously contained gaps. She remained essentially human, but now carried within her body the imprint of Corvin's ancient magic, a symbiosis that granted her capacity to bear shifter offspring despite her human origins. Thomas appeared within her chambers hours later, his presence suggesting that Corvin had sent for the elder healer deliberately. Thomas examined her with movements that were professional, yet carried undertones of reverence. He explained through Eleanor that the claiming had been successful beyond conventional parameters. Her biologic structure had been altered sufficiently to permit conception of shifter-human hybrid offspring. Whether those offspring would manifest as pure shifters, pure humans with enhanced abilities, or something operating between categories remained uncertainty that only time and biology could resolve. The modification granted her additional benefits. Her lifespan would extend substantially, potentially reaching 9 or 10 decades, rather than the 6 to 7 decades typical of ordinary humans. Her sensory capacities had been permanently enhanced. She possessed weak telepathic connection to Corvin that would strengthen through consistent proximity and emotional investment. She remained fundamentally human, but now existed as a bridge between human and shifter realities in ways that were unprecedented within the Fortress community. Over the following hours, Isabella adjusted to her transformed existence. The sensory expansion was initially overwhelming, information flooding her perception in patterns that seemed chaotic until her mind established frameworks for processing the abundance of new input. She could perceive Corvin's emotions as though they were her own, experience his satisfaction regarding the war's outcome, and detect the residual concern he harbored regarding potential complications from injuries sustained during combat. That evening, Corvin remained at her side. He did not demand or expect reciprocation of physical affection beyond her presence. His hand remained connected to her throughout the night, sometimes resting against her skin, sometimes intertwined with her fingers, the constant contact serving as confirmation that separation had ended, and whatever connections they had established would persist into whatever futures awaited them both. Chapter 8. The Bridge Between Worlds. 8 months had accumulated into the landscape of her transformed existence, and Isabella found herself existing in dimensions that would have seemed impossible during those early days of isolation in her cottage. By the 9th month, the rhythms of that life were undeniable. The confirmation had come through Thomas with careful precision. Life was growing within her, development progressing according to parameters that suggested biological success, despite the unprecedented nature of her circumstances. The pregnancy itself carried elements of strangeness that transcended ordinary human experience. Her body underwent transformations that medical knowledge from her previous world could not have anticipated or explained. Fevers came and retreated with regularity that suggested her physiology was adjusting to accommodate shifter genetics. Her senses continued their expansion, reaching levels where certain foods became overwhelming in their intensity, where sounds that had previously existed beneath conscious perception now manifested as distinct and sometimes intrusive information. Her emotional landscape underwent seismic shifts, moments of profound joy interrupted by periods of uncertainty regarding whether she had genuinely chosen this path or had been manipulated through circumstances beyond her capacity to resist. Corvin remained present with consistency that transformed from initially oppressive into something approaching essential. His hand found her frequently, resting upon the place where life grew beneath her skin, offering tactile confirmation of his commitment to both child and mother. He spoke to the pregnancy in that ancient language that Isabella still could not comprehend, vocalizations that seemed to carry ritualistic significance within shifter culture. There was tenderness in his voice that contradicted his physical appearance, contradicted the scars that marked his body as evidence of sustained violence. Brennan experienced his own transformation throughout the progression of Isabella's pregnancy. The child, now 8 years old and showing visible signs of emotional recovery, approached her expanding form with wonder that transcended ordinary sibling anticipation. He would place his small mouth against her belly at intervals, communicating in shifter vocalizations that Isabella could sense but not interpret. When she questioned Marin regarding the meaning of these sounds, the beta smiled with an expression that suggested amusement at the question. The child was speaking to his sibling, she explained, strengthening bonds that would exist long before physical birth. The formal recognition ceremony occurred during the 7th month of her pregnancy. The entire fortress assembled in the Great Hall, hundreds of shifters positioned according to hierarchical designation. Lords and alphas occupied elevated positions, warriors formed structural frameworks, servants and support personnel occupied peripheral spaces. Corvin stood elevated above the assembled masses, his bearing conveying absolute authority, despite the pregnancy-related modifications to his mate's appearance. The announcement was delivered through Eleanor, who translated the proceeding into linguistic frameworks that the assembled individuals could comprehend. Isabella was recognized formally as Queen Consort, Queen Companion, a title that had no precedent within recorded shifter history. She was consort to the Alpha King, carrying within her body the potential heir to territories that spanned vast geographical regions. She represented bridge between human and shifter worlds, carrier of genetic material that might usher forth new possibilities for their civilization. Lord Halwyn rose to acknowledge the announcement. His expression suggested internal conflict, reservations warring against recognition of reality before him. Yet when he vocalized his acceptance, his voice carried appropriate deference. He offered formal acknowledgement of Isabella's elevated status, though his eyes suggested calculation regarding implications this elevation might contain for established power structures. Not all reactions proved immediately supportive. Isabella detected currents of resentment flowing through portions of the assembled population. Some of the noble women who had anticipated elevated positioning expressed their disappointment through subtle modifications of body language. Several warriors appeared to question whether human blood should enter the Alpha King's lineage. But these objections remained subdued, contained by recognition that challenging Corvin's decision would represent fundamental rejection of his authority. What surprised Isabella most profoundly was the positive response from unexpected quarters. The children she had instructed in her teaching circle moved through the fortress expressing genuine celebration of her recognition. The healers and support staff seemed to embrace her elevated status with something approaching affection. Even some of the more conservative pack members appeared to recognize that her presence had genuinely improved fortress dynamics in ways that transcended sentiment or personal preference. The school was formalized during this same ceremonial period. Isabella had established it informally through gradual accumulation of children needing emotional support and educational instruction. Now it was recognized as legitimate institution, the first of its kind within Alpha King territories, dedicated specifically to rehabilitation and education of traumatized pups. She recruited other women shifters to serve as instructors, individuals who possessed their own histories of survival and recovery. Together, they created structure that offered not merely academic instruction, but emotional validation and psychological healing. Thomas provided regular assessments of her pregnancy's progression. The child developing within her manifested characteristics suggesting potential for complete shifter transformation, capacity to inhabit both lupine and human forms with equal facility. But this remained uncertain until birth itself. Hybrid development operated according to principles that biology had not yet fully revealed. The child might emerge as pure human with enhanced shifter abilities. The child might possess capacity to shift between forms. The child might display characteristics that existed entirely beyond conventional categorization. Possibility remained open, potential unresolved. Isabella faced genuine emotional turmoil regarding her pregnancy. Marin addressed this during private conversation that occurred in the fortress gardens, where Isabella had positioned herself during a moment of overwhelming anxiety. The beta offered perspective, grounded in her own experience of transformation and acceptance. Marin had been soldier in wars that had tested her capacity for violence and survival. She had learned that true autonomy did not exist as absence of constraint, but rather as conscious choice made, despite acknowledging consequences of those choices. Isabella had chosen repeatedly to remain, Marin pointed out. She had chosen to love Brennan despite the confinement that love entailed. She had chosen to develop teaching circle, despite limitations upon her personal freedom. She had chosen to accept claiming, despite uncertainty regarding its implications. Every choice had cost her something. Every choice had also granted her something in return. This was the fundamental nature of commitment, particularly commitment within societies where survival and power operated according to principles that transcended individual preference. During the final weeks of her pregnancy, Isabella found herself frequently positioned upon the fortress towers, observing the landscape that had become her world. The forest extended toward mountains that seemed to touch the sky itself. The territories visible from her vantage point spanned distances that would have required weeks of travel to traverse completely. She thought about the woman she had been, solitary weaver in isolated cottage, existing within narrow parameters of acceptable behavior and limited expectation. That woman had found a wounded creature in the forest and had responded with compassion. That simple act had cascaded through her existence like stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that had fundamentally reorganized every aspect of her being. She had been transported from solitude into fortress community. She had been drawn into a world of shifters and hierarchies and ancient magics. She had been transformed through ritual and choice into something between human and supernatural. But when she reflected upon it honestly, she recognized that her freedom had actually expanded rather than contracted. Yes, she could not walk away from this fortress or from the people depending upon her. But neither could she have walked away from her cottage after finding Brennan, not without fragmenting something essential within her own consciousness. The constraint she had resented was not externally imposed, but rather internal, arising from her own capacity for compassion and commitment. The birth occurred during 9th month, marked by Thomas with precision regarding both timing and biological indicators. The labor extended through 30 hours of sustained physical transformation as her body literally reshaped itself to permit passage of a child that was neither purely human nor purely shifter. Corvin remained at her side throughout, his presence providing anchor point when pain threatened to obliterate her consciousness entirely. When the child emerged, daughter, as Isabella immediately comprehended, the room fell silent with recognition of what she represented. The infant possessed characteristics that were simultaneously human and lupine. Her skin was pale like Isabella's, but her eyes held that distinctive amber-blue coloration that marked shifter heritage. Her small form contained capacity for transformation that would manifest as she developed neurologically. Brennan, present for the conclusion of labor, approached his new sister with wonder that transcended age or species designation. The boy, now 8, and substantially recovered from his trauma, recognized instinctively that this child represented completion of family structure. He was no longer single heir to Alpha King authority. He had sibling. He had family that extended beyond biological connection into something deeper. Corvin held his daughter for extended moments, his expression reflecting emotions too profound for linguistic articulation. He placed her against Isabella's chest with movements that were reverent, rather than demanding. In that gesture, Isabella recognized acknowledgement of what she had done. Not merely birthed child, but had become genuine bridge between two worlds. The recognition ceremony for their daughter occurred during the week following her birth. The entire fortress assembled to witness formal acknowledgement of Princess who was first of her kind, genuine hybrid possessing complete capacity for both human and shifter existence. Her name was chosen through consultative process that involved both Corvin and Isabella. They settled upon Neve, a name that carried meaning in both shifter language and human dialect. Over the following weeks, Isabella settled into existence that was fundamentally different from anything she could have anticipated. She was simultaneously woman, queen, mother, and healer. She maintained her teaching circle. She nurtured her daughter. She shared chambers with Corvin. And through their connection, she experienced dimensions of consciousness that transcended conventional human limitation. Lord Edwin visited the fortress during the celebration, following Neve's presentation to the formal court. The man who had employed her as simple weaver stood before her as queen companion and expressed genuine admiration for her transformation. He brought gifts for his former employee, fine threads and silk fabrics, materials for her continued weaving. But more importantly, he brought recognition that her choice to remain at the fortress had permitted her to become something infinitely greater than she could have achieved remaining in Brackham. As Isabella stood in the fortress gardens holding her daughter, watching Brennan play with other children she had instructed, she understood the fundamental truth of her journey. She had not been captured. She had not been imprisoned by forces beyond her control. She had been called forward into larger existence by act of compassion toward wounded creatures she encountered in snow. Every subsequent event had represented choices she had made consciously, accepting their consequences and their gifts. She was not human any longer, not completely. She was not shifter either. She was bridge, woman who moved between worlds, carrying within her the capacity to translate between differing existences. Her daughter would inherit this capacity. Her son, the child who had started this journey, had recovered his capacity for joy and connection. Her companion, the tall man who ruled territories vast beyond comprehension, had learned that strength could encompass vulnerability, that power could coexist with genuine partnership. The woman who had lived 5 years in isolation, weaving patterns into cloth for merchants to carry to distant markets, had discovered that her true purpose involved weaving connections between human and shifter, between isolation and community, between fear and possibility. She had found destiny not through force or manipulation, but through single act of choosing to save wounded creature in the snow.